I always feel, if you'll pardon the term, somewhat dictatorial about stifling the conversations that I've started. So let's start. Any questions, objections? Brett?
We're wondering, at least our group was wondering if you could give some historical examples of when the USSR accurately represented the proletariat and when they did not.
Sure. Starts in October Revolution. Well, yeah, October Revolution is when you're dealing with the USSR. You had the February Revolution, which installed a provisional government, which was a bourgeois capitalist government. It continued the war that everybody hated. The Bolsheviks tried to seize power in July. They were not treated too friendly after that. But then the whites were coming in to essentially disband the provisional government and install either a aristocratic dictatorship or the Tsar proper. And so Lenin and the Bolsheviks were returned armed to fight off the whites. They conveniently did not return their weapons, and they seized the government again, or tried to seize successfully the government in the October Revolution. Now there was the Soviets, which were workers' councils, and then there was the Constitutive Assembly, which was sort of like their parliament. Lenin said all power to the Soviets. The Soviets, in a certain sense, were non-democratic institutions. They were made up of concrete individual groups of workers, concrete individual groups of soldiers. Aristocrats were not allowed. Basically, intelligentsia, I don't believe, had their own Soviets. Peasants, as a matter of fact, didn't make or weren't part of a lot of Soviets unless they were soldiers' Soviets. And so in this case, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat in its literal sense. You also have this huge time of crisis in the Civil War. Most orthodox Marxist-Leninists, especially who are kind of touchy about Stalin, will say when Lenin dies, that's when you have, right, the bureaucrats move in. I would go up to at least the end of World War II. In this case, you have Stalin. It's not a pure dictatorship of the proletariat, because in the 30s, what happens is you get bureaucratic classes that are trying to basically secure their power. And it's really interesting. I have a friend of mine who does research on Soviet foreign policy, but also does work with the Soviet Union graduate level. And he was telling me about Stalin's constitution. Now, you can view it as self-serving, but Stalin actually wanted to institute more radical democracy through his constitution, because at the time, candidates had to be selected or at least approved by local party officials. And this caused a lot of resentment among the people, right? This would be why it's not a complete dictatorship of the proletariat. But he was trying to force through universal suffrage and the ability for anyone to run, because he reasoned that the people would then replace these corrupt bureaucrats who were trying to carve out their own fiefdoms. So what's the upshot of this? Well, the terror, the Great Terror, that comes about in 1939 is actually based, I mean, it has a lot of factors, but it comes from the bottom, right? So as late as 39, you have workers and you have peasants reporting corrupt party officials, and thus the party official being purged. Sometimes this meant work, sometimes this meant loss of position, sometimes this meant a very heavy case of lead poisoning. So, so yeah, I mean, as late as 39, you have a bottom-up purge that, right, I mean, it's often characterized as Stalin being this evil monster fighting his enemies, but most of the purges came from the bottom, because he said, look, if you're dissatisfied or you know corrupt bureaucrats who are wreckers and saboteurs, report them. And of course, all the people who had been suppressed by lower party officials report everyone above them. And so this is why you basically have everyone purged. So even the terror of 39 I would see as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. After World War II, Stalin attempts to stabilize the Soviet Union because it's, you know, undergone a civil war and modernization and World War II. And he begins to attenuate his position to the West. What date it is, I wouldn't know. But I'm not a hardline anti-revisionist who blames Khrushchev, evil, bad Khrushchev, for undoing everything Stalin did. I think that Stalin was moving towards revisionism. And so I would say late in Stalin's governance of the Soviet Union is when we see revision and when we see the loss of the dictatorship of the proletariat and its replacement with the dictatorship of the new bourgeoisie that goes by the name of the bureaucratic class.
Awesome.
Does that answer?
Do we want to go around? We had more questions.
Well, let's just go hands, and if nobody else has hands, I'll go to the next one. But Josh, you got a question for me.
Yeah, it's about the Paris Commune, and of course the Paris Commune is something that both Marxists and anarchists can get on board with, but I was wondering in what way the actual political organization of during the Paris Commune resembles, say, Bolshevik Russia or China or...
Very little. The organization of the Paris Commune most accurately resembles a mess. And this is a big chunk of the, I mean, not in any way to denigrate.
I mean this in response to Engels' endorsement of the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Oh, well, in this case, Engels, I mean, if you read State and Revolution, there's big, huge chunk block quotes of Engels. Engels, a little background on the Paris Commune, and I mentioned this to you guys, but I'll mention to you. If you want to know about the Paris Commune, Marx's On the Civil War in France. Great place to go. So if you're interested about that history, check it out. It's not too big. Basically what happens is you have the Paris Communards. You have Paris loses a war to Prussia. Prussia besieges Paris. Weird deal brokering going on. Paris remains independent, right? Okay, so what happens is the dictator, who I believe at this point is I forget his first name. It's Napoleon III. And so basically he wants Paris to basically foot the bill because Paris is one of the main industrial cities. They say no. They form a new provisional revolutionary government in Paris. At this point, the Prussians, or I believe they're Germans at this point, are just like, we don't want to mess with this, because they're granted a little piece of Paris, which is to say a park, a couple parks, and you have armed communards basically keeping them out, because the communards, unlike the French armies and other French units, did not turn over their weapons. So anyway, they start this up. They ask politely the banks to turn over some funds, and they start, moderately co-opting stuff. And they basically stay put. Now, Tulare, if I remember correctly, is the capital just a little ways away. They're like, what are we going to do? Paris, And of course, right, the communards do nothing. So Tulare scrambles and begs the Germans to literally turn over the armies that the Germans have captured so that they can put down the Paris Commune. And of course, they're willing to pay 5 million, I believe it's 5 million francs to do it. So the Germans are like, yeah, we'll give you back your army to kill a bunch of communists we don't like for 5 million francs. So what happens is these incredibly liberated, revolutionaries who man barricades and, start working in their own factories and are working to, compensate capitalists for things that they steal and, all that sort of thing. Long story short, they're put down. And they're put down hard. And so for Engels, as for Lenin, as for most Marxists, what they learn is you should not expect any mercy from capitalists. You should not restrain yourself when you are fighting a revolution. And so for Engels, obviously I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, so I'm going to have a really strong read of Engels. But you'll notice quote-unquote orthodox Marxists, they don't deal with Engels. They don't deal with dialectical materialism. They don't deal with his commentaries. They don't deal with his works on the state. And the reason why is because Engels learned this lesson as well, which is when you're fighting a revolution, you do what you have to do. And so, right, when he points to the Paris Commune, he says, look, armed people rising up, grabbing onto stuff and defending themselves. That's what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like. And so, I view Lenin as consistent with Marx and Engels and what they declare is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, does that answer?